Welcome to The Explainer. So, today we're going to dig into a perspective that basically asks us to question, well, everything we think we know about China. The source material we're looking at argues that the common Western narrative isn't the whole story, and maybe, just maybe, it's been deliberately crafted. So, right off the bat, our source material hits us with this really provocative question. It's a bold way to start, for sure, and it sets the stage for a total teardown of some of the most common beliefs about China's role in the world. Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. The source builds its whole case by tackling what it calls 3 central myths, or lies. So we'll just follow that roadmap, one by one. Okay, so first, let's challenge the narrative. The whole idea here, the central premise from our source, is that a lot of what we hear about China isn't just news, it's a story that's been specifically crafted to paint China as a threat. All right, first up, this idea of global domination. You know the story, right? That China is this aggressive power bent on taking over the world. But our source says, hold on, this whole narrative might be driven more by fear than by actual fact. So, is China really out to conquer the world? Well, to get to the bottom of that, the source tells us to just look at the numbers. Specifically, let's compare the global military footprint of China with that of the United States. The argument here is that actions speak a lot louder than words. And wow, when you put it side by side like this, it's pretty stark. The source points out that China has, just a handful of overseas logistics bases. Compare that to the United States with military bases in over 70 countries. And then there's the fact that China hasn't been in a military conflict for decades, while the US is, often involved in active conflicts. This contrast is absolutely central to the source's argument. And this is where the source really drills down on the idea of framing and perception. It's arguing there's a huge double standard at play. When China builds a logistics base, it's often reported as imperial expansion. But when the US has a base, it's justified as promoting democracy. See the difference in language there? And it's not just about military bases. Take the Belt and Road Initiative. The source wants to completely reframe this. Instead of seeing it as some kind of tool for political conquest, it's presented here as an economic partnership, pure and simple. It's about building infrastructure and boosting trade, not exporting a political ideology. Okay, let's move on to the second big myth the source wants to tackle, the whole issue of human rights. The narrative we usually hear is pretty straightforward, right? A state with no freedom that oppresses its people. But the source says, you know what? The reality on the ground is way more complicated than that. And to its credit, this source doesn't just dismiss the Western narrative. It starts by laying it out. We're talking about the claims regarding the Xinjiang region, the stories of mass detentions and atrocities against the Uyghur Muslim population. This is the story most of us are familiar with. But then, the source presents a whole other layer of context that it says is often just left out of the picture. It frames the actions in Xinjiang as counterterrorism measures. Those centers, it calls them de-radicalization and vocational training facilities, and it points to a massive drop in poverty in the region, arguing that this economic development is a key part of the government's strategy there. And we see a similar pattern when it comes to Hong Kong. The source points out how the 2019 protests were almost universally framed in Western media as this heroic fight for democracy against an oppressive China. But to understand China's perspective, the source says you have to go back to the one country, two systems framework. It argues that the protests didn't just stay as pro-democracy, they morphed into a movement seeking outright independence. And that, from Beijing's point of view, was a direct challenge to the one country principle. So, the response wasn't about crushing democracy, it was about defending its own sovereignty. All right, and that brings us to the third and final myth, this idea of an evil government. Here, the source really goes after the common portrayal of China's ruling party, the CCP, as this inherently oppressive, monolithic regime. So where does this evil government idea even come from? According to the source, it's not really based on a modern analysis of the CCP at all. It's basically a relic, a holdover from the Cold War. The argument is that if you're looking at today's China through that old 50-year-old lens, you're going to completely miss what's actually happening. So to counter that old narrative, the source gives us just one number, a really, really big number, 800 million. So what does that represent? Well, that number, 800 million, is the number of people the source says the CCP has lifted out of extreme poverty over the last few decades. It calls this an achievement unparalleled in history. So the key point here, according to the source, is that maybe we should be judging the system by a different set of metrics. not by our own political standards, but by its results for its own people. The argument is that the CCP's main goal has been stability and providing basic needs, things like healthcare, education, and housing. And it's done this using a model that it claims is rooted in China's unique history and has been pretty darn effective for its modernization. And this table does a great job of summing up the two competing viewpoints we've been talking about. On one side, you have what the source calls the Western focus. It's all about a lack of political freedoms, ideological differences, and that old evil communism stereotype. But on the other side, the source offers its counter-focus. Look at the success in providing basic needs, look at the incredible poverty alleviation, and try to understand the historical context of its governance. So what's the big takeaway here? The source basically concludes that these three big myths combine to create this really simplistic, almost cartoonish caricature of a deeply complex nation. It argues that framing China as this aggressive, evil villain completely distorts the reality of a country that, from this perspective at least, is mostly just focused on its own internal development. And that really just leaves us with one final big question to think about, doesn't it? How does the story we're told actually shape the reality we see? How much of what we think we know about the world is influenced not by the raw facts, but by the narratives we consume every single day? It's definitely something worth mulling over.